There is a plant that grows in bogs and wetlands across the northern hemisphere. Its dried pith soaked in any available fat produces a light brighter than an oil lamp for the same quantity of fuel. It was the primary light source for rural communities across Britain and Europe for centuries before the candle industry made it obsolete. Gilbert White documented it in 1789. He calculated that a family's entire annual lighting requirement could be produced for less than 1 shilling from plants growing in the nearest bog. The tallow candle industry charged more. The kerosene lamp industry charged more. The electric grid charged more every month for the rest of your life. The bog rush grows in every wetland in the northern hemisphere. The skill to process it disappeared within 2 generations of the candle industry's marketing campaign. Not because the light was inferior. Gilbert White measured it directly against tallow candles. The rush light burned brighter per unit of fuel, not because the plant was difficult to find. Common rush grows in every wetland, marsh, riverbank, and boggy field in Britain, Europe, North America, and Asia. Not because the processing was complex, a child could do it. Stripping the outer skin from a rush stem and soaking the pith in kitchen fat takes minutes per rush and produces a light source that burns for 30 to 40 minutes. Not because it was dangerous. The same fat used to cook the family's evening meal produced a light that lit the evening by which they ate it. The rush light was a closed loop. The candle industry was a purchase. One of those sustained a global market. The other sustained communities for 2,000 years. Without requiring one, subscribe and hit the bell. The next story opens soon. The archive opens in rural England in the summer of 1760, a Hampshire cottage. A woman and her children are cutting common rush from the wetland at the edge of their field. The rush grows tall in summer, reaching 3 to 4 feet. They cut it at peak growth. They carry bundles back to the house. The processing begins immediately. Each rush stem is held between the fingers. The outer green skin is peeled away in a long strip, running the length of the stem. The inner white pith is left intact on one side of the stem for structural support. The stripped rush looks like a thin strip of white sponge attached to a ribbon of green bark. It is set to dry in the sun for several hours. When dry, the pith is ready to absorb fat. The kitchen fat is melted in a shallow dish. Any fat works, bacon grease, kitchen drippings. The rendered fat from whatever meat the household had access to. The dried rush strips are laid in the fat and left for several minutes, absorbing it completely. They are then removed and set on a piece of bark or a flat stone to cool and solidify. When the fat has set, the rush light is complete. The entire process from harvesting to finished light takes an afternoon. The materials cost nothing beyond the labor. Gilbert White, the Hampshire naturalist who documented this practice in meticulous detail in his Natural History of Selborne, published in 1789, observed that a single pound of kitchen fat processed into rush lights would produce the equivalent of more than a pound of purchased tallow candles in terms of light output. He calculated, he documented that a family with access to bog rush and kitchen fat needed to spend 1 shilling annually to cover their entire lighting requirement for a year. He contrasted this with the 8 to 14 shillings that the same family spent purchasing tallow candles from commercial chandlers to produce the same amount of light. The rush light burned brighter per unit of fuel than the tallow candle. This is not sentiment. This is physics. The pith of the common rush is structured like a wick, drawing fat to the flame through capillary action more efficiently than the twisted cotton or flax wicks of commercial candles. The fat-to-light conversion rate of a rush light exceeded that of a tallow candle of equivalent fat weight. The rural poor who used rush lights were not using an inferior alternative to commercial candles. They were using a superior product that required no commercial transaction. The rush plant itself, Juncus effusus, common rush. It grows across every temperate wetland in the northern hemisphere without planting, without tending, without any agricultural input of any kind. It grows in the margins of rivers, in the edges of ponds, in bog fields, marsh meadows, and the low-lying wet ground that every farm has in some corner. It grows back every year from the same root system. It has been growing in these locations since before the concept of purchasing light existed. It requires nothing from the household that harvests it, except the knowledge of what it is and the afternoon needed to process it. Before the candle industry, every community in the wetland regions of Britain had access to free light from the same bog that provided them water, reed for thatching and willow for basket making. The bog was a community resource. The rush that grew along its margins was not a weed. It was a raw material, harvested in summer by the same people who thatched their own roofs. No market required, no monthly payment required. Medieval records of monastic communities document rushlight use in scriptoria and chapels where monks required light for copying manuscripts and for evening prayer. The Domesday Book references rush beds as managed agricultural resources in the records of several English estates. These were not accidental wetland features. They were cultivated light sources maintained as deliberately as the grain fields that fed the same community. The rush bed that provided light for winter reading was as much a food security resource as the kitchen garden, because in a world without light, the productive hours of short winter days ended at sunset. The rush bed extended those hours. Free, the Worshipful Company of Tallow. Chandler's was established in London in 1462. It was granted royal charter to regulate the production and sale of tallow candles across the city and eventually across England. The chandlers who made commercial candles had a legal framework for protecting their trade from competition. This framework did not target rushlights directly. It did not need to. The chandlers did not suppress rushlight knowledge through legislation. They suppressed it through the gradual association between commercial candles and social respectability. A household that burned tallow candles purchased from a chandler was a household that could afford to participate in the commercial economy. A household that harvested bog rush and processed kitchen fat into rushlights was a household that could not. The social distinction was real and was enforced through the way households presented themselves to their neighbors. As commercial candles became cheaper through the 18th century with improvements in production, the cost differential between purchased candles and free rushlights narrowed. The social differential between them did not narrow. It widened as the middle class expanded and the aspiration to commercial consumption grew. By the time Gilbert White documented rushlight production in 1789, he was already writing with the awareness that the practice was declining. He observed it among the poorest rural families, not as a universal practice, but as a survival technique maintained by those who could not afford the alternative. The families one rung higher on the economic ladder had already switched to purchased candles as a mark of their improved circumstances. The knowledge of rushlight production was already contracting toward the margins of English rural life. The Irish experience documents the transition most clearly. In rural Ireland through the 18th and early 19th centuries, rushlight was the primary illumination for cottages across the country. The Irish landscape is extensively boggy. Rush grew abundantly. Every Irish cottage had a rushlight holder as standard household equipment. The holders, called solas luachra in Irish, were among the most commonly manufactured household items in rural Ireland. When the Great Famine struck in 1845 and the rural population collapsed through death and emigration, the knowledge base that maintained rural Irish agricultural and household practices contracted catastrophically. The rushlight practice was among the casualties. The families who had harvested and processed rush for generations were dead or in North America. The knowledge did not travel on the coffin ships in any organized way. It dissolved into the disruption. The kerosene lamp arrived in the 1850s following Abraham Gessner's distillation of kerosene from coal in 1846 and the subsequent development of petroleum-derived kerosene. The lamp produced more light than a rushlight. It also required purchasing kerosene. The economic model that had sustained families through the free processing of a bog plant was replaced by a model that required a recurring purchase of a petroleum product. The families who had maintained rushlight knowledge for centuries switched to kerosene within one generation. The knowledge did not pass to the next. Edison's electric light bulb arrived in 1879. By the early 20th century, electrification was extending through urban areas and eventually into rural communities. Each successive technology produced more light. Each required a larger, more complex, more expensive system to sustain it. The electric grid that powers your light switch right now is a global infrastructure worth over $3 trillion that produces, transmits, and delivers light to your home and bills you for it every month for the rest of your life. The rushlight required a bog within walking distance, and an afternoon in August, the global lighting market generates approximately $170 billion per year. Lead manufacturers, utility companies, the infrastructure of poles and cables and transformers and generating stations, all of it designed to deliver light to households that previously produced their own from a plant growing in the nearest wetland. The plant is still growing. The wetlands that produced rush for rural English families in 1789 are still producing rush. Common rush is not endangered. It is classified as an invasive species in some regions because it spreads so aggressively into disturbed wetland areas. The plant that provided free light for centuries is so vigorous that land managers now work to control it. The knowledge required to process it is not lost, it is documented. Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne is still in print. His chapter on rushlights describes the process precisely enough that it can be reproduced by anyone who reads it and has access to common rush. Historical reenactment societies in Britain have demonstrated rushlight production continuously. The process works the same way it worked when White documented it. The pith still absorbs fat, the fat still burns. The light is still brighter per unit of fuel than a tallow candle. Here is the process. Cut common rush in late summer when the stems are at full height and the pith is well developed. The stems should be thick and firm. Cut at the base, bundle them loosely and carry them to a dry location. Lay the stems flat on a clean surface. Take each stem and peel the outer green skin in a long strip running the length of the stem, leaving one thin rib of skin attached along one side to maintain structural integrity. The exposed pith is white and soft. Set the stripped rushes in direct sun, or in a warm, dry room for several hours until the pith is completely dry. Melt any available fat in a shallow vessel. Bacon fat, lard, butter, vegetable shortening, any fat that solidifies at room temperature will work. Lay the dried rush strips in the melted fat and leave them to soak for several minutes. Turning once, remove them and place on a flat surface to cool. When the fat has solidified, the rushlight is ready. A rushlight holder is a simple forked grip mounted on a small weighted base that holds the rush at an angle for burning. Historical examples were made from twisted iron wire. A modern equivalent can be made from a piece of bent wire or from a simple wooden block with a notched groove to hold the rush at the correct angle. The rush burns best at approximately a 45-degree angle. Upright, it burns too fast. Horizontal, it gutters and produces smoke. 1 pound of fat processed into rush lights provides the equivalent of more than 1 pound of tallow candles in light output. A family's annual requirement for evening light, estimated by White at approximately 1,400 hours of illumination, could be produced from the rush harvest of one afternoon and the fat accumulation of one kitchen over several months. Total cost, the labor, total purchase, nothing. The $170 billion lighting industry requires that you not know this. Not through active suppression, through the passage of time and the social mechanisms that associated commercial lighting with progress and free natural lighting with poverty. 2 generations were enough. The Chandlers of 1462 began the association. The kerosene merchants of 1860 advanced it. The electric utilities of 1920 completed it. The bog rush grew through all of it. It is still growing. The utility companies that bill you for electricity have never mentioned the rushlight in a consumer communication. They do not need to. The technology gap between a rushlight and an LED is real and large, and the LED wins on every metric except cost of production. The LED requires a factory. The rush requires a bog. The LED requires a global rare earth supply chain. The rush requires kitchen fat and an August afternoon. The LED lasts 50,000 hours. The rushlight lasts 30 minutes per stem. On every efficiency metric, the modern technology wins. On the single metric of production cost to the household, the rush wins by a factor that makes comparison awkward. The question is not whether rush lights should replace electric lighting. The question is whether the knowledge of what the bog produces, what human ingenuity made of it for 2,000 years, should survive in living practice rather than in folk museum display cases. The knowledge that a wetland provides free materials for light is the same knowledge that understands wetlands as productive ecosystems rather than obstacles to agriculture. White wrote in 1789 that the rushlight had served the rural poor for as long as anyone could remember, and that its service had been honest, effective, and essentially free. He documented it because he understood that the practice was already beginning to disappear. He was right, the practice disappeared. The bog rush did not. One more thing Gilbert White documented in 1789. The families that maintained rush light production were also the families that maintained rush beds. They returned to the same wetland margins year after year. They harvested sustainably, cutting stems without destroying root systems. They noticed when the rush beds were healthy and when they were degrading. They managed the water levels near their fields not to maximize drainage for agriculture, but to maintain the wet conditions that produced the most vigorous rush growth. The rush-light economy created an incentive to maintain healthy wetlands. When the rush-light economy ended, the incentive ended with it. The same wetland margins that had been managed as rush beds were drained for additional agricultural acreage. The rush was classified as a weed that competed with more productive vegetation. Britain lost over 80% of its lowland wetlands between 1850 and 1980. The loss was driven by agricultural drainage. The agricultural drainage was enabled by the loss of the economic incentive to maintain the wetland. The economic incentive was the rush bed. The rush bed had been the light. It is in the wetland at the edge of the nearest field right now. Growing back from the same root system it has grown from every summer since before the worshipful company of tallow chandlers existed. The pith is forming. The fat is in the kitchen. The knowledge to connect them is in a book published in 1789 that anyone can read for free. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next story opens soon.